أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. During these past nights, we've been speaking about this concept of misguidance, and we've talked about various aspects of it. The last few nights, we spoke about different forces, different causes of misguidance. And we understood that cause doesn't mean a complete cause, where it's a determining factor, and that cause makes you misguided, but rather they're influencing causes that guide us away, lead us away from guidance and make us swerve if we give in, if we listen. One of those factors was Iblis. We looked at Shaitan in a couple of lectures and saw different ways that he misguides. And yesterday we talked about this, the idea of being misguided by ideas. Right? Islam is founded on certain ideas that give us our tenets of faith and a commitment to the way of life of a Muslim. And if we're exposed to ideas without preparation, without the proper way of sorting through those ideas and coming out with clarity, then it's a very dangerous business, and we could lose our guidance because of the corrupting effect of those ideas. Is it possible to have the children go into that room? If there's a way that can be reduced, that would be nice. Recite a salawat, please. What I'd like to speak about today is another influencing factor that is quite problematic as we're trying to find guidance. We call it different things, peer pressure. You could put a name on it, a majority complex or something like this as well. The idea that when we are in the minority, it's very difficult to maintain that path. When you see that the majority of people around you are following a path that's contrary to yours, that don't give importance to religion, that they don't, for instance, agree with your sets of beliefs. When you see the majority of people, and even amongst Muslims themselves, when you see the majority of Muslims, for instance, not adhering to Islam in a proper way and making compromises here and there, the more you are committed to following guidance, the more challenging it is, because you see that so many people around you are not. And it's very tempting to think, am I wrong for being alone? How could so many people be wrong and I alone be right? This influencing effect of the majority around us is very challenging, certainly for kids, for our children. Oftentimes, depending on their situation, they may be in, we call them public schools. I don't know if you have the same term of public schools here. So a public school system where, of course, it's a secular system. It's supposed to have no influence of religion, at least in theory. And oftentimes our children are going to be alone or with very few fellow Muslims in their school, and the vast majority of the culture around them is going to be something contrary to that. So it's very challenging if they're not rooted, if they don't have, if they're not prepared for dealing with that, for them to maintain a path as a Muslim while so many around them are not. But it's not specific to our children. Even as adults, this becomes a challenging thing. And we see the effects, the end result oftentimes, if we're not grounded, is that we become very non-committal to religion. We think of assimilation in the sense of compromising on our deen so that we can fit in better, so that we seem less odd, we stand out less. And of course that has an eroding effect on our deen. The Quran is very clear that the majority is almost always wrong, and the minority is the one that's right. Right? Just the opposite of our democratic kind of political values that we are raised with, where It's the majority that determines things. We talked about yesterday how ethical standards can be influenced, can be changed by society when there is no anchoring factor of divine law, for instance. If the anchoring factor is public opinion, then of course that changes. And by definition, public opinion is going to be what people agree on. What the majority sees to be appropriate or inappropriate, that becomes the standard. The Quran is constantly railing against the minority. There's a hadith that collects all of these together for us. It's in Kitab al-Kafi, the first book, the book of intellect and foolishness, Kitab al-Aqli wal-Jahl. There's a lengthy hadith in which Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam gives various different teachings to one of his companions named Hisham ibn al-Hakam. I think I quoted from this tradition, a different part of this tradition a few days ago in the earlier parts of this lecture series. In this section of the hadith, the Imam tells Hisham that Allah, the words he uses, ذَمَّ اللَّهُ الْكَثْرَ and then مَدَحَ الْقِلَّةِ. Right? Allah has in various verses in the Quran deprecated, railed against the minority. Right? Sorry, I said it the other way. I think I said it opposite. Let me correct that. So ذَمَّ الْكَثْرَ, I said that right, and مَدَحَ الْقِلَّةِ, that's correct. I translated it wrong. But he's railed against the majority, right? ذَمَّ الْكَثْرَ, and he's praised the minority. Right? Is that straight? I think I mixed up the words. So for instance, he says, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ. If you follow the majority of those on earth, they'll lead you astray. He used that same word, yudillu, right, that we've been talking about. Idlal is to cause misguidance, to cause dalal. وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. If you follow most people, the majority, then they will lead you away from the path of God. Why? Because their way of thinking is flawed. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. They're not about finding certainty. They're not about basing their beliefs on fact and on knowledge. They guess, they suppose, they think it's probably like this. This is what I like. This is my feeling. This is my opinion, and that becomes the basis for a belief. And if your opinion and your feeling and I like this and don't like this, if those kinds of things, or very shoddy kinds of arguments, like yesterday I talked about atheism and how it's founded on this fallacy that the lack of evidence for a thing means that the thing doesn't exist. Right? If you think about that, that's a nonsensical, illogical premise. But that's the foundation for an atheistic stance. If someone's adamantly atheistic, it's a very flimsy position. They might speak very eloquently. They might speak in very strong terms and seem like they have a lot of confidence, but it's an illusion of confidence, or it's deceived confidence. They have that confidence, but it's based on nothing. Right? You can have yaqeen and you can have certainty. We talked about iman yesterday or a couple of days ago. You can have certainty and conviction that's baseless. That's possible. Right? We can convince ourselves of the truth of something despite the fact that we have no reason for doing so. So just the kind of the statement or the air of conviction shouldn't fool us into thinking that the basis for that conviction is always true. We should examine any claim of conviction. If someone says they're certain about something, they know something for sure, it's not about, we can't take their word for it. We must see the evidence itself and say, well, what's your basis for this conviction that you have? And then evaluate that ourselves and see if we're also convinced the same way they are, or if the reason for their conviction was something else that's some sort of a bias and a prejudice. Right? Sometimes people have very bad experiences with religion, with organized religion, and because of that, they become very jaded. And if they had a specific bad experience with a specific religion that we also agree is a false religion, right, they do themselves a disservice by saying, well, all religions are basically like this. All religious leaders are basically corrupt. All religions are based on these different fantasies and these kinds of things. And that makes them jaded against any new claim of religion. Even if it's a totally different religion that claims completely different things from the thing that they originally had a bad experience with. Right? So the verse says that if you follow the majority of people, they'll lead you astray. They'll lead you away from the path of God. Or he says, for instance, أكثرهم لا يعلمون. Right? He talks about لئن سألته من خلق السماوات والأرض ليقولن الله قل الحمد لله بل أكثرهم لا يعلمون ولكن أكثرهم لا يعلمون. I don't remember this. Right? So if you ask mushrikeen who created the heavens and the earth, they'll say Allah. Right? But they don't understand the consequences of that. This is a different false belief that they had. Mushrikeen, pagans, they typically accept that God is the creator. Right? They're polytheistic at a different level, but they accept that there's an ultimate God. If you ask a Hindu, for instance, or any sort of pagan who worships multiple gods, who is the creator, they always have a supreme God, like the uppermost God. But their idea is that this God is he's too grand. Right? It's almost like it's an extreme form of tanzih, of tasbih. Right? We also say subhanallah. He's far above anything that we can fathom. You describe Allah, think of Allah in some way, subhanallah, He's much higher than anything that we can think of. So we have that same sentiment within Islam as well. But that doesn't mean that we can't know Him. It doesn't mean that we can't interact with Him. But the pagan belief is that God is so grand and so mighty that he could care less about us. He's made us, He's created us, but now He has better things to do. He has a whole cosmos to run. He can't be bothered with our individual supplications and prayers and the management of affairs, so He's turned it over to these lesser gods. And these lesser gods, which are the ones that they worship, they think لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى. Right? The reason why they worship them is so that these lesser gods can get them closer, can intercede on their behalf before Allah. All right, so the verse anyway is speaking about that belief and the fact that they do admit that God is the creator of everything, but they don't make the connection that if He's the creator, if He's the source of everything, then He's the one that you should be asking everything from. If He Himself hasn't appointed these lesser gods as intercessors, on what basis are you appointing them? إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا أَسْمَاءٌ سَمَّيْتُمُوهَا أَنْتُمْ وَآبَاؤُكُمْ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ بِهَا مِنْ سُلْطَانٍ. Right, these lesser gods, these are things that you and your forefathers have created names for. You've named this the God of war, and this the God of peace, and this the God of agriculture. These are all your creations. Allah never appointed any authority to these kinds of gods. So if you admit that God is the creator and the source of everything, and He has the right over everything and owns all of the cosmos, then why not ask Him who you're supposed to worship? Why not worship Him directly? Why do you have to go to these made-up gods that you've made yourselves? Right? So he said, if only they would think, they would make that connection, and they would come out of their state of shirk and worship the one God that they recognize as the creator of everything. وَلَكِنْ أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. But most of them don't understand, they don't think, they don't know, and don't realize the connection between the kernel of a true belief they have and the contradiction with the false beliefs that they've developed. Yeah, so these verses, they deprecate, put down the kathra, the majority. And on the other hand, what about the few, the minority? وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ. It's the few who are grateful to Allah. And we learned about gratitude a little bit the other day as well. Like, gratitude is that in that real sense, not simply saying shukran lillah and thanking Allah with our tongue, but truly showing gratitude and recognizing that everything is from Him, so many blessings from Him. And if we even try to recognize it, then we realize we're not able to. There's a hadith Qudsi where Musa alayhi salam and Allah are speaking, and Allah says, Musa, thank me as I deserve to be thanked. And Musa reflects and finally says, that's impossible, I cannot possibly thank you the way you deserve to be thanked. Allah says, that's exactly what I wanted you to realize. Now that you've realized that, you've come a little bit closer to praising me as I deserve, or thanking me the way I deserve to be thanked. By recognizing your own impotence to thank me, that's at least one step, that's one step towards properly thanking Allah. If we try to enumerate and say, let me count the 10 things that Allah has given me, and we limit His blessings to something and say, these are the main 10 things, and that's all I'll thank Him for, we've done it injustice, because وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. If you try to count the blessings of Allah, you'll never get to it. You'll never be able to fully encompass the blessings. So recognizing your impotence is the first step towards truly recognizing the fact that Allah's blessings are innumerable. وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ. But few are truly grateful to Allah. Right? So He praises the few who are shakur. The vast majority are ingrates, are kafur, are ungrateful. And similarly, we have other verses that praise the minority praise the minority and deprecate the majority. But this is a very challenging concept when you're actually living it. Like I started with, when you're faced with a community around you, peers, especially people who are influential, and then their numbers are so much greater than yours. To think that they could all be wrong and you could be right is a very daunting idea to grapple with. I want to share with you some ahadith that speak to the same idea. There is a in Hijjatul Wada, in the farewell pilgrimage, really the only Hajj that the Prophet performed, which we know as the kind of the farewell Hajj. There were various stops along the way where the Prophet gave sermons. And these sermons have been recorded by both Sunni and Shi'i sources and are an important resource that we have. There's a tradition in Al-Kafi where a few generations after the Prophet, in the time of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, a person comes to him and asks him. So the questioner is a person by the name of Sufyan al-Thawri. Right? If that person is not familiar, he is known as a Sufi, a non-Shi'i. He himself probably would have thought himself as maybe a student of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, but really more like a peer and an equal to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. That was his perception of himself. And we have a lot of interactions between him and Imam Sadiq. One of the telling ones is where he comes to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and he was probably dressed in respectable clothes. This is 150 or so years after the Prophet's passing. The Muslim Ummah is through conquest and all these things, the standard of living is quite high compared to what it was at the time of the Prophet. The Imam was wearing respectable clothes. Sufyan, as a Sufi, he was used to wearing tattered clothes. You know how monks and these kind of ascetics will dress in kind of tattered clothes and sometimes not bathe and not comb their hair. They kind of look disheveled. As a way, they think this is a way of humbling themselves and getting closer to Allah and distancing themselves from the dunya. Right? So this Sufyan Thawri thought this was the way to be humble and to get closer to Allah. And so he comes to the Imam and he says, I don't recall ever reading about the Prophet or Ali ever dressing in such fine clothes as you now have. This is Sufyan speaking to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Imam Sadiq says that was a different time. Right, the time of the Prophet, the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam, this is a time when the Muslims were really struggling. Financially, economically, people were really hard off. And so the Imam and the Prophet, they gave everything they had to the people. They had to live at the level of the people. And so they shared their wealth, they did whatever they can to help people, and they also ended up wearing tatters. Right? Not because they were renouncing the dunya in that sense of being an ascetic, but because this is the standard of living of all the people. If they're to come out in regal robes while their followers are poor, that would be terrible. That would be an injustice. And so the time was different. Now the time is different. If I were to wear those kinds of clothes that they wore and it was normal at that time and proper at that time, then you would look at me as a beggar. Right? I would be seen as a beggar. It would be below my status. And so it would be unacceptable. And then he says to Sufyan, he grabs hold of Sufyan's clothing, all tattered and all of this. He grabs hold of it, he says, this outer clothing that you have, this is what you show people. He moves the clothing aside, and underneath, Sufyan has very fine clothes. He says, on the other hand, I have these outer clothes that are nice and respectable. This is what I wear in public to keep up my face and my name, to maintain my dignity. But at home with myself, and he lifts his own clothes and he says, this is what I wear. And he has tattered clothes underneath. Right? So this is, I think, telling of Sufyan's position, always trying to be very self-righteous, always trying to show up the Imam and find fault with him. So in this one tradition in Al-Kafi, the narrator of the tradition is someone that we don't know. He's known as some person from Mecca. And Sufyan is his companion. They're together. And Sufyan has the idea, he says, let's go to Ja'far as-Sadiq and ask him a question. I have a question that's very pressing. Let's go to him and we'll ask. And so these two go. As they get to Imam Sadiq, perhaps this is around the time of Hajj. It makes sense because he's in Mecca. He's, it seems like he's in the season of Hajj. Not for sure, but it seems like it. So Sufyan and this companion of his, they make it to the Imam when the Imam is he's just gotten onto his mount, his horse or camel, whatever he was riding, and he was getting ready to go somewhere. Sufyan says, I have a pressing question I need to ask you. The Imam says, I'm just on my way to go somewhere. If wait, and when I return, then I'm at your service. I'll answer whatever question you have. Sufyan, insisting, says, no, like by your grandfather and by this and by that. He makes all these oaths, and he says, I ask you to answer the question. So the Imam begrudgingly gets down off of his mount and says, okay, here, I'll tell you what you want. So Sufyan says, I want you to narrate for me the Prophet's sermon at Masjid al-Khayf. And Masjid al-Khayf is one of the historic and very holy masajid in Mina. And so there's a famous khutbah that the Prophet delivered at Masjid al-Khayf. He says, I want you to narrate it for me, and I'll write it down and record it. So he tells Imam Sadiq, he doesn't even bring his own pen and pencil, he tells Imam Sadiq to ask someone to bring some pen and paper for him. So the Imam indulges, and Sufyan's ready to write, and the Imam narrates the tradition, the sermon. He says, Uktub Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Khutbatu Rasulullah fi Masjid al-Khayf. نضر الله عبدا سمع مقالتي فوعاها وحفظها وبلغها من لم تبلغه. So the Prophet, he begins this khutbah saying, may Allah bring joy to the servant who hears what I have to say. نضر الله عبدا سمع مقالتي, and then not only hears it but remembers it, records it, becomes a container for that knowledge. And then not only does he record it for himself, but then he conveys it to others who didn't have the ability to hear it when I said it. Right, so this is a way for the Prophet to ensure that whatever he said would be disseminated. Right, so he made sure that people knew the virtue of not only listening and recording, but also passing it on. He says, Ya ayyuhan nas liyuballigh ash-shahidul ghaib. Those who are present, let them convey what I have to say to those who are absent. فَالرُّبَّ حَامِلِ فِقْهٍ لَيْسَ بِفَقِيهٍ وَالرُّبَّ حَامِلِ فِقْهٍ إِلَى مَنْ هُوَ أَفْقَهُ مِنْهِ. That's a very famous statement of the Prophet. Sometimes the immediate audience of the Prophet, the one who heard the hadith, may be able to record it and remember it, but he doesn't really understand the meaning of it. Right, so he can record it, he can be a vehicle for Allah to disseminate the knowledge of the Prophet to others, but he himself, his understanding is limited. And so he plays a vital role. He shouldn't say that, well, I don't understand that, so I'm going to neglect that particular hadith. That's not for me. He shouldn't do that. Rather, everything he hears from the Prophet, he should record it to the best of his ability, remember it, and pass it on to others. Even if he doesn't fully understand the meaning of it, pass it on to someone else, because there will be other people who have greater understanding, who are afqah, right, have more tafaqquh, deeper understanding than he as the conveyor. Right, so again, this is one of the things that the Prophet would say to encourage people to be recorders of hadith and to transmit it on to others. He says then, ثلاث لا يغل عليهن قلب امرئ مسلم. And then he lists three things. He says that there are three things, the Prophet's still speaking, there are three things, three qualities that if a person has, he won't fall into corruption. He won't stray away from the path. لا يغل means that he won't become kind of a traitor to his beliefs. Right? So if you want to hold fast to your beliefs, hold fast to the deen, then these are three qualities that you should try to bring about within yourself. First, he says, إِخْلَاصُ الْعَمَلِ لِلَّهِ. The first is to make your actions purely for the sake of Allah. Right? So in a practical sense, when you do things, do them with a consideration for what Allah thinks, whether He's happy with you. Make that your goal. Don't worry about what people think, whether you're impressing someone or not impressing them, whether it serves a particular interest or not, whether that person will be able to help you down the road. Like don't make all these negotiations when you're acting. In your actions, it should be purely for the sake of Allah. Right? That's the manifestation of taqwa. If you truly fear Allah, then He's at the forefront of your mind always, that you're worried, is he pleased with what I'm doing or is he displeased? And that's the standard. Okay, that's the determining factor. If he's pleased, then yes. If he's not pleased, then no. Not, I know he's not pleased, but I can get some advantage if I do this or do that. And so you have all these other considerations. No, do it purely for Allah, and that will keep you grounded in your Islam. Second, he says, وَالنَّصِيحَةُ لِأَئِمَّةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. Right, the second, nasiha, means to have goodwill. To have goodwill for the leaders of the Muslims. This is the Prophet speaking. So what does goodwill to the imams mean? To want the best for them, to wish the best for them, to follow them, to obey them, to give them their proper due. Make them your leaders and you follow them, respect them, and treat them as the sources of knowledge that they are. Ask them questions and take what they say as revelation, as something that's from Allah and guidance from Allah. So treating the imams with their proper due and obeying them and following them, that's how you can show goodwill to the imams of the Muslims. The third thing the Prophet says is وَاللُّزُومْ لِجَمَاعَتِهِمْ. Hold fast to their congregation, their jama'ah. Who the there refers to is a question. So is he saying al-luzum li jama'at al-a'imma? That makes sense. That the congregation that congregates around those a'imma, those leaders of Islam, that's the congregation that you should hold fast to. Right? So the imam is the core of that congregation. He's, like Imam Ali talks about himself, as al-qutbu min al-raha. Right? So think of a wheel that spins. He's talking about like a mill that turns around, and the axle that's in the middle of that wheel is the imam. Around him, everything turns. Right? Of course, he's not comparing himself to Allah. He's saying, but the dunya, knowledge, guidance, all of these things, they revolve around the imam. So the congregation, the jama'ah that congregates around the imam as their core and their focus, that's the congregation that we should do luzum to. We should adhere to and be part of that congregation. Another way that we can understand it, jama'atihim, if it's jama'at al-muslimin, right? Hold fast and be with the congregation of Muslims. This, at first, it might seem like that's much more general. It's speaking about all Muslims in a general sense, Sunni, Shi'i, all the different sects of Muslims. But wouldn't make sense, it wouldn't jive with the second thing he said. First he said to have nasiha to the imams, to have goodwill to them. How can you have goodwill to them and then stick with a jama'ah that doesn't even accept them and belittles them and thinks of them as nothing or as mere companions and these kinds of things? So even if you think of it as adhering to the congregation of Muslims, it's not Muslims in that very general sense. It's those Muslims who consider the imam to be the center of everything and respect the imam as he deserves to be respected. Right? So either way, whether you take jama'ah as jama'atul a'imma or jama'atul muslimin, in both cases it means the same thing. Hold fast and adhere to, be part of the congregation at whose center is the imam and the leader of the Muslims. All right, and then there are a few more lines of the khutbah, but then after the imam narrates this for Sufyan writes the whole thing down, puts it in his pocket, and they depart. The imam also departs, goes back on his way because he was after some business at the time. So these two people, the narrator and Sufyan, they're riding along, and after a while, Sufyan is probably kind of mulling over the imam's words, and he stops and tells his companion to stop as well, and says, let me just read over what I've written and reflect on what the imam has told me. As he does this, his companion, who is either a Shi'i or at least has Shi'i leanings, he himself draws some conclusions for Sufyan and says that the imam has really put you in a tough spot. The imam, by quoting this hadith of the Prophet, this khutbah of the Prophet, he says, put certain burdens on your shoulders that you'll never be able to shrug off. And so now Sufyan is curious, what part of the khutbah has this kind of consequence? And now, like, itmam al-hujjah has been served to me. Basically, my position is now compromised, and I must accept the imam's position. What part of the sermon of the Prophet does this? So the companion tells him that it's these two phrases. One was this an-nasihatu li a'immatil muslimin. Right? Having goodwill for the imams. The Prophet is saying that you have to have goodwill for the imams. You as a Sunni, he's speaking to Sufyan, right? Who do you consider these imams to be? Right? Now if you go back to the Khulafa al-Rashidun as you know them to be, what's the basis for their leadership? Is it that they took charge? That they seized power? That people accepted them as their leaders? What is the basis for this? He says, whatever that basis is, that exact same basis that you think gives them the authority to be leaders of the Muslims, he says the same thing applies to Muawiyah and Yazid and Marwan. He says, النصيحة لأئمة المسلمين من هؤلاء الأئمة الذين يجب علينا نصيحتهم. Who are these imams whose goodwill, or to whom goodwill is due from us? He says, is it Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, wa Yazid ibn Muawiyah, wa Marwan ibn al-Hakam, wa kullu man la tajuzu shahadatuhu, wa lam تصم ولم يغتسل من جنابة وهدم الكعبة ونكح أمه فهو على إيمان جبر. Actually, sorry, I skipped a couple of lines. لا تجوز شهادته وتجوز الصلاة خلفهم. لا تجوز الصلاة خلفهم. So is it every person who wouldn't even be qualified and wouldn't have the credentials to be able to give witness in a court of law? Right? Because a shahid has to be adil, has to be a righteous person who's upright, at least in public, has to be an upright person. But here, the imams that you, Sufyan, think are imams, fine, you might say that the first three khulafa were righteous people and whatnot, but what was the basis of their leadership? Whatever that basis was, their credentials were the same as the credentials of the ones who followed them, Muawiyah, Yazid, Marwan. And so if you think that leadership is there for anyone who takes leadership, anyone who is kind of voted in and supported by people and people give their bay'ah to, then that standard holds true not only for the first three khulafa, but also for these khulafa that have come after Karbala, after Imam Hassan, Muawiyah, Yazid, and Marwan. And so he says this one point that the Imam made, saying a'immatul muslimin, and you have to have nasiha towards them. It's like ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. For Allah to absolutely, unconditionally say that we owe obedience to these ulil amri minkum tells us that whoever these ulul amr are must be someone who is proper to follow. If it's someone who makes mistakes and forgets and screws things up and sometimes does the wrong thing, and Allah saying you must follow him no matter what, even if he's on a sinful path and a wrong path, no, you must follow him because he's your leader, that would be unjust of Allah to then hold us accountable for following bad leaders. So whoever those ulul amr are have to be someone whose absolute obedience is correct for Allah to order us to. Similarly, the Prophet saying that you owe nasiha to a'immatul muslimin tells us really explicitly that whoever these a'immatul muslimin are, these leaders, must be someone to whom the Prophet can command us to have goodwill and to follow them and obey them absolutely without condition. Right? So this friend or companion of Sufyan, he says that this is one point against you, that it basically seals your case and makes it so that you can't maintain your position against Ja'far as-Sadiq and the imams before him and the imams after him. The second, he says, is al-luzum li jama'atihim. This is where my point is. We're going to return back to this idea about the majority and so forth. So al-luzum li jama'atihim. This man asked Sufyan, which jama'ah do you think the Prophet intended? And where is this jama'ah that we're supposed to stick with now? He says, فَأَيُّ الْجَمَاعَةِ مُرْجِئٌ يَقُولُ مَنْ لَمْ يُصَلِّ وَلَمْ يَصُمْ وَلَمْ يَغْتَسِلْ مِنْ جَنَابَةٍ وَهَدَمَ الْكَعْبَةَ وَنَكَحَ أُمَّهُ فَهُوَ عَلَى إِيمَانِ جَبْرَئِ وَمِكَائِيلِ. Is this jama'ah that you think that the Prophet is telling us that we have to stick to, does it consist of these people known as murji', people who kind of have the same idea as evangelical Christians now, who say that faith alone is sufficient? If you have faith, then whatever action you do doesn't matter. If you don't pray, you don't fast, you commit all sorts of sins, that's irrelevant. If your faith is there, then that's sufficient. Is that the jama'ah the Prophet's telling us we have to stick with? Because that's a big, there were groups of people who had this kind of belief at this time. Or he says, is it, for instance, the Qadari? قدري يقول لا يكون ما شاء الله عز وجل ويكون ما شاء إبليس. Right? Somebody like the Mufawwida, we talked about delegationism. So someone who thinks that Allah has delegated authority so that we now act independent of Him, that we can do what we want to do, even if He doesn't want us to do it, we can do it. And we have full authority over our own actions. Is it that kind of a person and that sect of Muslims that we're supposed to stick to? Right? So he goes on and he mentions 4 or 5 different deviant sects that even Sufyan himself would say these are deviant sects. But these are large portions of the Muslim community. And so his question is, when the Prophet wants us to stick to the jama'ah, to congregation, and be with the group, what group is it? Which of these sects, which of these deviant ideas is it that the Prophet wanted us to stick to? Because they're mutually contradictory. Right? So he says this also seals his case against you, because the jama'ah, that the only way it makes sense for the Prophet to order us to stick with the jama'ah is if that jama'ah is with those a'imma, the congregation that's following those imams that the Prophet has already told us to have goodwill towards. That's the jama'ah that we have to stick with. Right? So the point is, the story itself I think was interesting, and the interaction and learning something about Sufyan al-Thawri and the imam's response to him, all of that was interesting. But the point that relates to our topic is, we sometimes get confused by these ahadith where we have the Prophet talking about the jama'ah and that we should be with the jama'ah. Jama'ah meaning congregation, the community, the majority, be with everyone, as opposed to being a sect here and a sect there. Right? And we think, well, if the Prophet's saying that, then doesn't that mean the majority? Should we be seen as a sect of Muslims, as opposed to the Sunnis who are seen as Muslims? Oftentimes we as a minority, we have this minority complex where we tend to marginalize ourselves. Oftentimes I've seen this where, a Sunni organization will be Islamic something of something. Right? Muslims, so they'll name themselves as Muslims and Islam and this and that. Whereas if it's a Shi'i organization, it's the Shi'i something of this. Right? We name ourselves as Shia, as, we automatically exclude ourselves from the title Muslim in Islam. And that just feeds the fire of Wahhabis and others who want to marginalize us and make us seem like we're Rafidi and we're this and that, we're deviant and we're a sect. When the reality is, the Islam of the Ahlul Bayt is the Islam that goes from Adam all the way to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam. This is kind of orthodoxy, if you want to talk about it. The Orthodox Islam is the Islam of the Ahlul Bayt. What we call Shi'i Islam is the Islam of the Ahlul Bayt. That's a better term, I think, to use than Shi'i Islam. Anyone else who's broken off, no matter how big their group may be, is a sect. They're a deviant sect that's broken off from the teachings of this line of prophets and imams. Don't be fooled by numbers and think, well, because we're a minority and the majority is doing something else, the majority is orthodox. Right? That Western scholarship puts the title of Orthodox Islam on Sunni Islam. And we as Shia are called heterodox, meaning we're not orthodox, we're a branch, we're a sect, we've broken off, like so many other sects have broken off in history. Why do we have to accept that? That's not our theology, that's not what we understand. We're following the imams as intended by the Prophet, as intended by Allah, as intended by all of the prophets before. This is Orthodox Islam, this is real Islam. And sticking with this is sticking with the Jama'ah. So I'll share a couple of ahadith. I know my time is just about up. I'll say just about because I know it's actually up already. So this question was there amongst people as well. Somebody asked to ask the Prophet himself, because he would speak about this jama'ah and sticking with the jama'ah. So someone asked the Prophet, "Ma jama'atu ummatik?" Right? What is this congregation in your ummah? What does that constitute? How do we know that we're with the jama'ah? What does that mean? Is it the majority? Is it numbers? What is it? So the Prophet himself replies, "Man kana ala al-haq wa in kanu asharatan." It's those who are with the truth. Their numbers are irrelevant. He says even if they're 10 people up against hundreds and thousands, it doesn't matter what the number is. It's those who hold fast to the truth that are the core, that are the center, that are the congregation that you're supposed to stick to. So he doesn't want us to stick with numbers. He wants us to look at the truth and go with that truth, even if it's a few people. One other tradition also speaks to the same idea. This is from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Somebody asks him to explain to him about the sunnah, what it means by sunnah, what's a bid'ah, and then what's the jama'ah and what's a firqa. So what's the congregation and what's a sect? What is the standard for determining who is the congregation and the main kind of majority and who's a deviant sect or a firqa? He says, Al-jama'atu ahlul haqq wa in kanu qalilan. Whoever is on the true path with truth, they are the jama'ah, the congregation, even if they're few. وَالْفِرْقَةُ أَهْلُ الْبَاطِلِ وَإِنْ كَانُوا كَثِيرًا. Right? The sect is those who have deviant ideas, no matter what their numbers may be. Even if they have much greater numbers than those who hold the truth, they are, in the terms of the Prophet, they're the ones who classify as the sect, and these classify as the orthodox or the mainstream. It's more challenging than simply saying it. We can say this amongst ourselves, we can say it to ourselves, we can understand it from the guidance of the Prophet and the Imams that truth is what's important, not numbers. The reality is that it's a little bit scary when you're out there by yourself, at work and at school and in society. There's a piece of advice that Imam Ali alayhi salam gives us in Nahj al-Balagha. He says, لا تستوحشوا في طريق الهدى لقلة أهله. So just because you're alone on the path and there's no one else with you, don't feel uneasy. Don't feel lonely. If you're on the right path, as long as you're sure it's the right path, right? And make sure it's the right path. Be humble enough to question and to learn and to think about it. Don't just commit to a path and say this is the truth just because that's what I've been taught. Because somebody else who has a lot of influence and has a lot of charisma, he says it's true, so it must be true. That's not good enough. You can't hold that in front, on the day of judgment and say, this is my credential, this is my reasoning for why I followed this path, because so-and-so said, or I was influenced by that person. Do you not have a brain yourself? Do you not have a mind yourself? Can you not learn yourself? Ask questions, be humble, entertain the possibility that you could be on the wrong path. Ask the question, reevaluate, make sure that what you're doing, what you think, what you believe is in fact true. That's perfectly, when we have a path of truth, there's no danger in asking questions about it. If our faith was based on illusions and duplicity, then I would be up here saying, don't ask any questions, here's our doctrine, no Q&A afterwards. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to have the answer, but the answer is there. It's always a clear answer. It's a matter of searching for it and exploring. And the more you delve into Islamic knowledge, the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, the Quran, the more understanding you will have, the more things make sense. It's not that more questions arise and you become more and more confused and you start to think that there's so many things that are wrong and we're just kind of brushing them under the rug. Yes, there are questions we can't answer, but they're minor things. They're not the core principles that we have. So لا تستوحشوا في طريق الهدى لقلة أهله. So Allah, we pray to you that you shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad and keep us on the right path. Help us to stick to the path even if we're alone on it. As long as we are with the Ahlul Bayt, then let us know that we are on the right path. And if we are ever against them, even if the whole world is with us, let us know that we are on the wrong path. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.